It was January 1959 when Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student, gathered his friends for the expedition of a lifetime. Their goal? To conquer Kholat Shukl, a desolate peak whose name in the Mansi language ominously meant Mountain of the Dead. 9 friends, including experienced mountaineers and students, eagerly set out on their trek. They were Igor Dyatlov, the confident leader; Zina Kolmogorova, intelligent and spirited with a soft spot for Igor; Yuri Doroshenko, brave and quick-tempered; Lyudmila Dubinina, stubborn and bold; Semyon Zolotaryov, a mysterious older man with a military past; Rustem Slobodin, calm and athletic; Nikolai Thibault Brignol, a cheerful joker; Yuri Krivonashenko, music-loving and mischievous; Alexander Kolovatov, thoughtful and observant. They set off with laughter in the crisp air, unaware that the snow beneath their feet would become their grave. On the third day, the weather grew colder. The icy wind bit through their coats as they trudged through waist-deep snow. "We'll set camp before the ridge," Igor instructed, consulting his map. That night, as the wind howled outside the tent, Lyudmila awoke with a start. She could have sworn she heard something, a distant guttural growl. But when she peered outside, there was nothing. Only the endless white. The next morning, they noticed something unsettling. Large, unfamiliar footprints surrounded their tent. Barefoot footprints. The tracks disappeared into the woods, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. "There's no logical explanation," Semyon muttered, his military instincts kicking in. But Igor dismissed their fears. "The mind plays tricks in the cold, he said. "Let's keep moving." Little did they know, the mountain was watching. The sun had barely risen when the hikers dismantled their camp. The snow beneath their feet crunched ominously, and the cold wind clawed at their skin. Despite the unsettling footprints they'd seen, Igor insisted on continuing the trek. "Stay close," he commanded. "We'll reach the pass by evening." But an unspoken fear lingered in the air. Lyudmila kept glancing over her shoulder, the echo of that guttural growl still fresh in her mind. Semyon, with his military past, remained on edge. Every crack of ice, every shifting shadow, felt like a silent predator watching from afar. Hours passed. The landscape grew even more unforgiving. Snow-covered ridges loomed above, and the trail became harder to follow. As the storm clouds gathered, the sunlight dimmed, casting an eerie twilight across the slopes. Then, it happened. "Did you hear that?" Yuri Doroshenko froze, his breath visible in the icy air. A low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the air. It was neither the howl of the wind nor the groaning of distant ice. It was something unnatural, a sound that seemed to come from the very mountain itself. "It's just the wind," Igor said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But Lyudmila shook her head. "No, it's something else. Something's wrong." By the time they reached the edge of the Dyatlov Pass, the storm had arrived in full force. Snow swirled violently, obscuring their vision. They had no choice but to set up camp for the night. Igor and Yuri struggled to pitch the tent, their hands trembling from the bitter cold. The others gathered inside, huddling for warmth. But even within the thin walls of the tent, the feeling of dread persisted. As darkness fell, the wind outside seemed to wail, like a mournful spirit. The hum from earlier had returned, louder this time, vibrating through the ground beneath them. "What is that?" Nikolai whispered. No one had an answer. Midnight came. The temperature dropped even further. Zina clutched her blanket tightly, unable to sleep. Then, she saw it. Through the thin fabric of the tent, a shadow moved. Not a trick of the light. No, this was deliberate. A dark figure, barely visible, circled the camp. Zina's heart pounded. She wanted to scream, to wake the others. But the figure was gone, just as quickly as it had appeared. The hikers survived the night, but their resolve was cracking. Something unnatural was unfolding on that cursed mountain. And as the storm raged on, they could no longer deny it. They were not alone. Morning arrived, but the sun was nowhere to be seen. A thick fog had descended upon the mountain, casting everything in a pale, lifeless gray. The wind had calmed, yet an eerie silence engulfed the landscape. It was as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. Igor emerged from the tent, his breath visible in the freezing air. "We need to move," he announced. "The storm has passed, but we can't stay here." The others silently obeyed, though a heavy weight lingered in their hearts. As they packed up, Yuri Krivonashenko, known for his playful spirit, wandered a few meters away to relieve himself. But within moments, a frantic scream pierced the silence. "Igor, come here!" The group rushed to his side, their boots crunching through the snow. What they saw made their blood run cold. There, partially buried beneath the snow, was a fragment of torn fabric. It was crimson-stained, the unmistakable color of dried blood. But that wasn't all. Next to the fabric lay a piece of metal, twisted and blackened, as if scorched by intense heat. What is this?" Zina stammered. Igor knelt, examining the charred fragment. "It looks like some kind of aircraft debris. But no planes crashed here," Semyon said, his voice low. "At least, none we know of." A suffocating silence followed. They all knew the rumors. Whispers of government experiments, secret tests conducted in the desolate wilderness. Was this what had left the strange footprints? Was this why the mountain was shrouded in fear? "We should leave," Lyudmila urged, her voice trembling. "Now." But Igor shook his head. "We came here to reach the summit. We're not turning back." It was a decision he would soon regret. The hikers pressed on, but the unease grew with every step. The shadows seemed darker, the wind colder, and always that low, unnatural hum vibrated beneath their feet. By nightfall, they made camp once again. The tent felt smaller, suffocating even, but no one dared suggest sleeping outside. As the others drifted into an uneasy slumber, Zina remained awake, her eyes fixed on the fragile fabric of the tent. Every creak of the wind, every distant crack of ice made her flinch. Then it happened. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging against the frozen earth. It circled the tent, slow, deliberate. Zina's heart pounded. She held her breath, praying it would pass. But the sound grew louder, closer. In the dim light, she saw Lyudmila stir, her eyes fluttering open. Zina placed a trembling hand over her mouth, signaling her to stay silent. The scraping stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then, a single guttural whisper echoed through the tent, a voice, low and distorted, barely human. "Leave." The tent shook violently as if unseen hands clawed at it. The hikers awoke in a frenzy, their screams lost in the howling wind. But just as suddenly as it began, the chaos ceased. Nothing remained outside, only untouched snow. "We're leaving at dawn," Igor declared, his face pale. No one argued, but dawn would never come. The first light of dawn barely managed to pierce through the heavy clouds. The air was thick, and the snow glistened like 1,000 shattered mirrors. Despite the terrifying events of the night, Igor forced the group to prepare for the day's trek. "We head down," Igor declared firmly. "No more climbing, we're returning." No one objected. The fear was etched into their faces, the kind of fear that stripped away pride and courage. As they dismantled the tent, Semyon noticed something strange. "Look," he pointed to the ground. There were footprints, but not their own. They were large, misshapen, and seemingly bare, as if left by someone without shoes. They twisted and turned, circling the campsite, then vanishing into the distant white. That can't be possible," Yuri Doroshenko murmured. "We saw no one, and in this cold, walking barefoot, it wasn't human," Lyudmila whispered, her voice trembling. But Igor wasn't willing to surrender to fear. It could be a trick of the snow, or even an animal. "Let's move." They followed him in silence, their every step swallowed by the ominous emptiness of the mountains. But the feeling of being watched never left them. By midday, the storm clouds gathered again. A biting wind howled through the pass, stinging their exposed skin. Visibility dropped, and the snow thickened like a dense white curtain. "We need shelter," Igor shouted over the wind. "Find a spot." They stumbled onward, blinded and disoriented. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the snow cleared for a brief moment, and that's when they noticed. Yuri Krivonashenko was gone. "Yuri!" Zina screamed, her voice swallowed by the storm. The others spun around, scanning the endless expanse of snow. There were no footprints, no sign of struggle, only the relentless, empty white. He was right behind me," Semyon stammered, his breath rapid. "I swear he was." Panic set in. They called his name, their voices cracking. But the mountains gave no answer. "He couldn't have just vanished," Igor insisted, though doubt crept into his voice. "We'll find him." But deep down, they all knew. Something unnatural had taken him. Desperation drove them forward. The snowstorm eased, but the biting cold remained. Hours passed. The sky darkened once more, and exhaustion gnawed at their bones. "We'll set camp here," Igor said reluctantly, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. As the others pitched the tent, Semyon wandered further down the slope, his mind clouded with dread. But then, he saw it. Barely visible in the dim light was a strange structure. It looked like a jagged formation of rocks, but something about it was unsettling. A circular pattern, as though deliberately arranged. Semyon's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, brushing away the snow, and gasped. At the center of the formation was a blackened mark, as if the ground itself had been scorched. Burned fragments of metal and bone protruded from the frozen earth. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't natural. "Guys!" Semyon called, his voice echoing. "Come here!" But the wind responded with a low hum, the same hum they had heard before. Only now, it was louder, almost alive. And somewhere in the distance, the shadows shifted. Semyon's frantic voice brought the others stumbling through the snow. They stood around the scorched ground, their eyes wide with disbelief. The remnants of charred bone fragments gleamed beneath the frost, brittle and ancient. This can't be from an animal," Lyudmila stammered. "It's human." Zina covered her mouth, trembling. "But who and why?" Igor knelt, brushing his fingers across the darkened earth. The blackened fragments of twisted metal lay in stark contrast to the pale snow. Whatever had caused the burn was no ordinary fire. "Radiation," Semyon whispered. "Or something even worse." Igor clenched his jaw. "We don't have time to figure it out. Yuri is still out there. We keep moving." But as they turned away from the ominous sight, something happened. A deep rumble echoed through the mountains. The ground beneath their feet quivered, sending a wave of fear through the group. The wind howled in that terrible hum. The sound they had all tried to ignore returned with terrifying intensity. Lyudmila clutched Igor's arm. "It's coming from inside the mountain." "No," Igor shook his head. "It's beneath us." The realization was bone-chilling. Whatever force haunted the Dyatlov Pass, it wasn't bound to the surface. It lived within the very earth, echoing through the frozen stone. Night fell faster than expected. The sky, once clear, was now suffocated by a thick blanket of clouds. Even the stars, their only guiding light, had disappeared. The tent was their only refuge. Huddled together, the hikers barely spoke. The silence was unbearable. Every gust of wind, every crack of ice sent shivers down their spines. Zina was the first to break the silence. "We shouldn't have come here," she whispered. "The locals warned us. The Mansi people call this place Kholat Shakhl, the Mountain of the Dead." "No," Igor's voice was firm. "We don't believe in superstitions." "But what about the footprints, the whispers?" Lyudmila's voice trembled. "And Yuri, he's gone." Igor clenched his fists. "We don't know what happened, but panicking won't help." The others fell silent, though fear had already consumed them. The tent offered little comfort. The fabric rustled in the wind, and shadows danced across the walls. Then, in the dead of night, it came again, a low, guttural whisper. It seeped through the cold air, brushing against their ears like the breath of something unseen. "Leave!" Semyon bolted upright. "Did you hear that?" But before anyone could answer, a deafening crack echoed outside. The ground trembled. The tent collapsed partially, the poles bending under an unseen force. "Get out!" Igor shouted. The hikers scrambled, forcing their way into the freezing night. The storm had returned, but the sky above them was no longer empty. A strange light hovered in the distance. It was unnatural, a glowing sphere pulsating like a heartbeat. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space like a mirage. The hikers stood frozen, their breaths clouding the air in panicked gasps. What is that?" Zina whispered, but no one could answer. The mountain had awoken. The glowing orb hovered above the snow, pulsating with an eerie rhythm. Its unsettling light cast long shadows across the frozen ground. The hikers stood motionless, their eyes locked on the inexplicable sight. "It's impossible," Semyon stammered, but the orb remained. It was neither the moon nor a star. It emitted no warmth, only a quiet hum that seemed to vibrate through their bones. "We need to move," Igor said, his voice strained. "Now." The others didn't argue. Panic surged through them, driving their trembling legs forward. They trudged through the snow, barely daring to glance back, but the unsettling presence lingered. As they moved, the orb seemed to follow. Hours passed, yet the sphere remained in the sky, distant but unyielding. The hikers were exhausted, the biting cold gnawing at their limbs. Every crunch of snow beneath their feet echoed through the desolate pass. "We're not going in circles, are we?" Lyudmila asked, her voice quivering. Igor shook his head, though uncertainty clouded his expression. "We're going south, I'm sure of it." But as they continued, something changed. Semyon, walking slightly ahead, stumbled upon a patch of disturbed snow. He knelt, brushing away the frost, and froze. Footprints, but they weren't their own. The prints were deep, as though left by someone running. Barefoot, the twisted, uneven patterns seemed to mock them. It's the same prints, Semyon whispered. The ones from the campsite. Zena's breath quickened. But how? Who could survive this cold without shoes? No one answered. The fear was suffocating. Then, from the shadows, came a sound. A faint, distant whistle. It was not the wind. It was deliberate. A hollow, beckoning tune that carried through the air. The group turned sharply, scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" Igor called, his voice cracking, but there was no response. Only the endless, snow-covered expanse. "Keep moving," Igor ordered. "Whatever it is, it's trying to break us." By the time the pale light of dawn attempted to break through the storm clouds, the hikers could barely stand. Their limbs were numb, their faces burned by the cold. The orb which had followed them for so long was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. "We need shelter," Lyudmila pleaded. "There's no choice," Igor said through chattering teeth. "We dig a snow cave. It's our best chance." The group worked with trembling hands, carving out a makeshift refuge in the snow. They crawled inside, huddled together for warmth. But even in the confined space, the terror didn't fade. Zena clutched her knees to her chest. "You think Yuri's still alive?" Igor didn't answer. No one did. The question lingered, like a cruel reminder. Hours passed, though none of them could sleep. The walls of the cave seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against their minds. Then came the whisper, "You shouldn't have come." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A presence unseen and insidious. Semyon bolted upright, his eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" Igor gripped his shoulder, his face pale. "We all did." And in that moment, they knew. The mountain wasn't finished with them. The cave was silent, but the hikers could still hear the echo of the voice. A faint, unsettling whisper that refused to leave their minds. The darkness around them felt heavier, as though the mountain itself was watching. "We can't stay here," Igor whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever that was, it knows where we are." "But we're exhausted," Lyudmila replied, her face pale. "We won't survive out there without rest." "We won't survive in here either," Semyon muttered. "Not if it comes back." A suffocating dread settled over the group. The thought of leaving the fragile shelter was terrifying. Yet the idea of staying was worse. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice. "We wait until dawn," Igor finally said. "Once the light comes, we move." No one argued. They huddled closer, their breaths mingling in the frozen air. But sleep never came. The howl of the wind hours passed. The wind outside howled like a wounded creature, rattling the thin walls of snow. But beneath the storm's roar, something else stirred. A faint scratching. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but soon it grew louder. A rhythmic scrape, like nails dragging across ice. Lyudmila's eyes shot open. "It's here," she whispered. The others sat up, their hearts pounding. The sound circled the cave, moving closer, pausing, then beginning again. "Stay quiet," Igor mouthed. But then came the whisper, "Leave. You were never meant to return." The words slithered through the air, low and guttural. It was no longer distant. The voice was inside the cave. Semyon's hand trembled as he reached for the small flashlight. With a shaky breath, he flicked it on. The dim beam swept across the snow walls, empty. But in the corner, something was wrong. The snow was wet. Dark streaks stained the frozen walls, dripping like ink. It smelled of iron. "Blood!" Lyudmila gasped. Igor scrambled back, his chest heaving. "It's not ours. It's something else." And then, without warning, the scratching stopped. The wind died. The cave fell deathly silent. "We're leaving," Igor growled. "Now the mountain's claim." The hikers stumbled into the freezing night, their breaths visible in the thin air. The storm had eased, but the sky above them remained pitch black. Only the faintest glow of the stars guided their way. "We head south," Igor commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. No stopping, no looking back. But as they moved, the mountains seemed to shift around them. The towering peaks loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged forms blending into the shadows. The snow beneath their feet crunched softly, but each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself resisted them. Semyon stole a glance behind. The cave was gone. Only an unbroken field of snow remained. "It's like it never existed," he murmured. "They're leading us," Lyudmila said, her voice trembling. "The mountain, it wants us to go somewhere." Igor's jaw clenched. "Then we'll go." but on our terms. The hikers pressed forward, unaware of the dark figure that watched from the distant ridge, unseen, unmoving, waiting. The biting cold gnawed at the hikers' bones as they trudged through the endless snow. The wind whispered through the mountain passes, carrying faint echoes that sounded disturbingly like voices. Igor led the group, his eyes locked on the distant ridge. Despite the darkness, a strange sense of direction pulled at him, an inexplicable urge to keep going. "We should have seen the tree line by now," Lyudmila murmured, her teeth chattering. "But it's just snow everywhere. The mountain's playing tricks on us," Semyon said through ragged breaths. "It wants us lost." Igor didn't respond. His hands were numb and his leg burned from exhaustion. But deep inside, something warned him that stopping would be far worse. The tracks in the snow hours passed. The dim glow of dawn threatened to break through the heavy clouds. Just when the hikers dared to hope, Lyudmila's trembling voice shattered the silence. "Look," she gasped. There, in the pristine snow, were footprints, but they weren't their own. The prints were massive, bare, twisted, and staggered. Whatever had made them was walking on two legs, yet the impression it left behind was inhuman. Semyon crouched down, brushing his fingers along the edges of the print. It was deep, as if something heavy had passed through. "These aren't fresh," he murmured, "but they weren't here before. Something's ahead of us." A shiver ran through Lyudmila. "Or it's behind us." The group scanned the horizon. The jagged peaks cast long shadows over the snow, and for a moment, it almost seemed as though the darkness moved. "Stay close," Igor commanded. "No matter what." The forgotten camp. By midday, the hikers stumbled upon a sight that made their stomachs churn. A tent. It was half collapsed, buried under layers of snow. The faded fabric flapped weakly in the wind. Scattered around it were torn sleeping bags, broken equipment, and footprints leading away into the trees. "This can't be real," Semyon whispered. "It looks old." Igor's hands shook as he approached. He recognized the tent's design. Soviet military surplus. The same kind their own group had brought. "This is our tent," Igor murmured, his voice hollow. "But how? We never circled back." Lyudmila's eyes widened in horror. "Then whose footprints are those?" The vanishing shadows. Night fell once more. The hikers, too terrified to remain near the cursed tent, continued their journey, but the air had changed. The cold no longer felt natural. It was thick, suffocating, as though the very mountain exhaled its presence upon them. Igor stumbled, and as he rose, he caught a glimpse of movement. A tall figure, barely visible against the snow, disappeared behind a ridge. "We're being followed," he hissed. The others froze. The shadows twisted, dark forms flickering at the edges of their vision. Low whispers echoed through the night, fragmented, unintelligible, but undeniably human. "Keep walking," Igor growled. "Don't stop. Don't listen." But as the whispers grew louder, Semyon couldn't resist. He turned toward the sound. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the ridge, unnaturally tall, its face obscured by the shadows. It wore tattered clothing, its arms hanging limply, but its eyes, they glowed with a pale, haunting light. "Semyon!" Igor yanked him away. "Don't look!" The figure didn't move. It only watched. And as the hikers stumbled onward, the whispers followed. Semyon stumbled backward, his scream echoing through the frozen air. As the creature lunged, its twisted grin widened, unnaturally. Its hollow eyes burned with a sinister glow. Igor reacted instinctively, yanking Semyon away from the creature's grasp. The figure's limbs jerked, moving with unnatural speed. Lyudmila's trembling hands gripped the ice axe she carried, but fear rooted her to the spot. "Run!" Igor shouted. They bolted through the snow, the sound of the creature's guttural growls trailing behind them. The mist thickened, swallowing their surroundings. No matter how fast they ran, the whispers followed, taunting, laughing, calling. "She's not real." Igor's voice cut through the chaos. "It's the mountain. It's playing with us." Lyudmila's chest heaved, but it looked so human. "That's what it wants us to believe." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at Igor's mind. The creature had spoken. It had pleaded for help. Could it have been a lost soul, twisted by the mountain's curse? Their footsteps pounded through the snow. The bitter wind bit at their skin. The shadows twisted and shifted around them, forming grotesque shapes that disappeared the moment they looked directly at them. Semyon's breathing grew ragged. "We can't keep running. We have to face it." Igor shook his head. "You can't fight what you don't understand." The creature's distant growl echoed once more. But this time, something changed. The growl was joined by others, low, inhuman voices. Rising in unison, Lyudmila whispered, her voice trembling. "They're multiplying. It's not just one." Igor's jaw clenched. The air felt heavier, as though the mountain itself bore down on them. The whispers became louder, speaking in fragmented words, foreign, ancient, malicious. But amidst the whispers, a single phrase stood out: "You cannot leave." The vanishing path. Igor tried to focus, scanning the terrain for any sign of a descent, but the landscape had shifted. The steep slope they had followed was gone, replaced by jagged cliffs and towering ice formations. "It's like the mountain's alive," Semyon muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't want us to leave," Lyudmila said, shivering. "It wants us to become part of it." Igor's hands tightened into fists. "Then we find another way." They moved cautiously, the crunch of snow beneath their feet the only sound. The whispers remained, but the growls had faded. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the mountain had relented. But as they rounded a bend, Lyudmila gasped. The broken shrine stood before them. Once again, the twisted altar, the blood-stained earth, the ominous carvings. It was as if they had never left. Semyon stammered. We've been walking in circles." Igor's heart pounded. "No, it's worse than that. The shrine wasn't just a landmark. It was a trap. And now, it was awake. The awakening, a low rumble shook the ground. The altar's cracked surface began to pulse with an eerie crimson glow. The twisted symbols along its base seemed to writhe, as though alive. From the depths of the fissures, a dark mist slithered upward. It coiled and twisted, taking on vague forms. Faces contorted in eternal anguish, their hollow eyes gazing into nothingness. Semyon stumbled back. "What is this?" Igor's voice was hollow. "The seal. It's breaking." A deafening crack echoed through the air. The altar split further. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The whispers rose to an unbearable crescendo. Lyudmila clutched her head, the sound piercing through her mind. "We have to stop it." Semyon's voice was desperate. "But how?" Igor's eyes locked on the carvings. "The seal was made once. It can be sealed again. But at what cost?" The mountain didn't wait for an answer. From the depths of the altar, the shadows began to rise, and the nightmare had only just begun. The ground beneath their feet quivered as the shadows writhed, twisting into monstrous shapes. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. From the cracked altar, an ominous black mist seeped into the air. Igor's heart pounded. "We need to move, now." But the shadows didn't wait. They slithered along the snow, stretching toward the three hikers like fingers of death. Semyon pulled Lyudmila away as a dark tendril lashed past them. The ground beneath it instantly blackened. "They're alive," Lyudmila gasped. "Not alive," Igor corrected, his voice strained. "There's something worse." The figures began to emerge, twisted humanoid forms, their hollow eyes glowing with a dim, eerie light. Their skeletal bodies were wrapped in tattered remains of clothing, as if remnants of those who had once tried to escape the mountain's curse. The dead had risen. Igor's mind raced. The creatures moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their bones cracking with every step. One of the twisted figures dragged a mangled leg behind it, while another's face was frozen in a permanent scream. "They were like us," Lyudmila whispered, horror etched on her face. "Hikers who never made it out." The shadows swarmed closer, their whispers forming a single chilling demand. "Join us." Semyon's hands trembled. "We can't fight them." Igor scanned the area, searching for an escape. His eyes fell upon a narrow crevice along the mountainside. It was barely visible through the mist, but it was their only chance. "There," he pointed, "through the gap." The three sprinted toward it, the creatures snarling in pursuit. Lyudmila stumbled, but Semyon caught her before she could fall. Igor reached the crevice first, squeezing through the jagged opening. "Hurry," he urged. The twisted figures clawed at the edges of the crevice, their bony fingers scraping against the rock, but the gap was too narrow for them to follow. For now, the hikers were safe, but not for long. The crevice opened into a dim cavern. The walls were etched with ancient carvings, similar to those on the cursed shrine. Flickering shadows danced across the stone, their shapes eerily familiar. "This place," Lyudmila's voice wavered. "It's like the mountain is alive. It remembers," Igor muttered. "Every soul that's perished here." every moment of fear. It's all trapped. Semyon ran his fingers along the carvings. They depicted the same twisted figures that had pursued them, but among them, one image stood out. A group of 9 figures encircled by the shadows. The Dyatlov group, Igor whispered. They were here. Lyudmila's voice caught, and they never escaped. The shadows along the walls shifted, and the whispers grew louder, but this time they were clearer. The voices of the lost spoke through the darkness. Find the light, end the curse. The 3 exchanged fearful glances. Somewhere within the mountain, the key to breaking the curse remained. But finding it would mean facing the shadows once more. We have no choice, Igor said. We end it or we die here. Chapter 21, Descent into Darkness. The cavern twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the mountain. The air grew colder with each step. Jagged icicles hung from the ceiling, and the walls pulsed with a faint crimson glow. Stay close, Igor whispered, his voice barely audible over the whispers. Semyon clutched his chest, his breath shallow. It's like the mountains suffocating us, but they couldn't stop. Every step brought them closer to whatever force bound the mountain's victims. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. In its center stood a towering stone monolith, cracked and covered in the same twisted carvings. At its base, a dim light pulsed, a fragile, flickering glow. The heart of the curse, Lyudmila murmured. But before they could approach, the shadows stirred. From the darkness, the twisted figures emerged once more. Only this time, they were not alone. A massive figure draped in tattered robes towered above the others. Its hollow eyes burned with a terrible light, and its skeletal hands reached forward. You cannot end what was never meant to be undone. The cursed guardian had awakened. Igor's pulse pounded as the monstrous figure advanced. The whispers swirled in a violent storm, threatening to consume them. Lyudmila clutched her chest, struggling to breathe. We have to reach the monolith, Igor shouted. But the guardian moved swiftly, its skeletal form blocking their path. Semyon swung his ice axe, but it passed through the creature like mist. It's not bound by this world, Lyudmila gasped. It's a shadow, a memory of the curse itself. Igor's mind raced. Then we weakened the memory. He tore a flare from his pack, striking it against the stone. The crimson light blazed, momentarily driving the shadows back. The guardian recoiled, its form flickering. Light, Igor realized. It's the only thing that can fight the darkness. Lyudmila and Semyon quickly followed suit, igniting their remaining flares. The chamber glowed with a fierce red hue, forcing the shadows to retreat. The guardian roared, but its strength wavered. Now, Igor shouted, to the monolith! The 3 rushed forward. The pulsing light at the base of the monolith intensified, as though sensing their presence. Igor placed his hands upon the cold stone, the whispers surging into his mind. Break the seal. Without hesitation, Igor pressed against the monolith. The ancient carvings began to glow, the crimson light spreading upward. The guardian howled in agony, its form fracturing. The shadows thrashed, but the monolith's light consumed them. Piece by piece, the darkness shattered. And then, silence. The chamber dimmed, and the oppressive weight lifted. The curse had been broken. But as the mountain trembled once more, Igor knew their fight wasn't over. The ancient monolith stood cracked, its glowing light dimming with every passing second. The ground beneath the hikers rumbled, sending loose stones tumbling down the walls. A low, groaning sound echoed through the cavern. The mountain itself was trembling. We need to get out of here, Semyon shouted, pulling Lyudmila to her feet. Igor's gaze remained fixed on the fractured monolith. The shadows that once plagued them had vanished, but something deep within the stone pulsed with remaining energy. The curse is broken, Igor said, his voice firm. But the mountain, it's collapsing. A deafening crack split through the air as a large portion of the cave ceiling gave way, narrowly missing them. The hikers stumbled, dodging falling debris. The entrance, Lyudmila cried, spotting the narrow crevice from which they had entered. Igor nodded. Go, I'm right behind you. They sprinted across the unstable ground, the rumbling intensifying. Chunks of rock crumbled around them, the ancient carvings disintegrating as the curse unraveled. Just as they reached the entrance, the cavern let out one final violent roar. The mountain was reclaiming its secrets. They emerged into the blinding snow, the bitter wind cutting through their clothes. The ground beneath their feet still trembled, sending shockwaves across the icy landscape. Behind them, the entrance to the cursed cave collapsed entirely, sealing the horrors within forever. The mountain, now rid of its ancient torment, seemed eerily silent. Lyudmila collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Semyon clutched his chest, his heart racing. Igor remained standing, his gaze fixed on the broken rock face. "It's over," he whispered. The storm that had raged for days had calmed. The once howling wind now carried only a soft breeze. It was as if the mountain itself had been freed, but the memories lingered. The whispers, the twisted figures, the monstrous guardian they would never forget. "What now?" Lyudmila asked, her voice trembling. "We keep moving," Igor replied. "We find the others, and we tell the world the truth." Days passed before the rescue team found them. Weak, frostbitten, but alive, the 3 survivors were airlifted from the mountainside. The media swarmed, desperate for answers. But the truth was far more terrifying than any headline could capture. Igor, Lyudmila, and Semyon were the only ones who knew what had truly happened. The whispers, the shadows, the cursed monolith. The world wasn't ready to understand, yet there was no denying the evidence. The bodies of the 9 lost hikers from the Dyatlov expedition were recovered, their mysterious injuries still unexplained. Some with crushed bones, others with missing eyes and tongues, just as the legends described. But the strangest part, the site where the monolith had stood was now nothing but a hollow, snow-covered pit. No carvings, no remains, as if the mountain had consumed it all. And though the rescue team reported clear skies and stable conditions, Igor knew the truth. The mountain's curse may have ended, but its secrets would forever remain buried. Weeks later, Igor stood by his cabin window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. The nightmares hadn't stopped. Every night, the shadows returned. The whispers still echoed in his mind. He wasn't alone in his torment. Lyudmila had grown distant, unable to escape the visions of the twisted figures. Semyon, once strong-willed, now spoke in fragmented sentences, haunted by the memories of the cursed guardian. The world moved on, dismissing their story as mere superstition. The government, unwilling to stir panic, sealed the investigation. The official report cited hypothermia and natural causes, but Igor knew better. One evening, as the wind howled against his cabin walls, he heard it once more, the unmistakable voice from the mountain. "You freed us." But the shadows never truly disappear. A chill ran down his spine. Somewhere deep beneath the snow and ice, the mountain's ancient evil stirred once again. Despite the lingering fear, Igor knew that they had done what no one else could. The curse that had plagued the Dyatlov Pass for decades had been broken. The shadows that once ruled the mountain had been banished, freeing the souls trapped within. But miracles often come at a cost. Igor, Lyudmila, and Semyon had emerged from the mountain forever changed. They had witnessed the impossible, faced the unimaginable, and survived. Yet the scars would remain, a constant reminder of what they had endured. Still, amidst the darkness, there was hope. For the first time in years, the Dyatlov Pass remained silent. Hikers dared to return, their laughter echoing through the once cursed slopes. The locals spoke of a newfound peace, a stillness that had not existed for decades. And though the shadows had vanished, the mountain's story would never be forgotten. Igor took one final look at the snow-covered peaks in the distance. The memories would haunt him forever, but he knew the mountain's curse no longer held power. The Dyatlov Pass had been freed, and so had they. The end.